Chapter 18 Pemberley. Mr. Bennet's marriage had been the result of a lack of good judgment. Attracted by youth and beauty and that appearance of good temper which they usually give, he had married a woman whose weak understanding and narrow mind had very soon put an end to real love for her. Respect and confidence had gone forever, and his hopes of happiness at home were ended. But he was fond of the country and of books, and his wife's foolishness and lack of knowledge gave him amusement. Elizabeth had never been blind to the unfitting nature of her father's behavior as a husband. It had always upset her, but respecting his abilities and grateful for his caring treatment of herself, she had tried to forget what she could not fail to notice. But she had never felt so strongly as now the disadvantages that must be experienced by the children of so unsuitable a marriage. When Lydia went away, she promised to write very often and in great detail to her mother and Kitty, but her letters were always long expected and very short. Those to her mother contained little but unimportant news, and those to Kitty, though longer, contained too many secrets to be read to the family. Life in Meryton was undoubtedly duller after the regiment had left. Elizabeth began to look forward to her northern tour with her aunt and uncle, the date of which was approaching. Her disappointment was therefore great when she learned that business prevented her uncle from being away from London as long as he had hoped. They were forced to give up the visit to the lakes and to choose a shorter tour. According to the present plan, they were to go no further north than Derbyshire, where Mrs. Gardiner hoped to revisit the town in which she had spent the earlier part of her life. There were many ideas connected in Elizabeth's mind with the mention of Derbyshire. It was impossible for her to see or hear the word without thinking of Pemberley and his owner. At last, the period of waiting was over, and Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, with their 4 children, appeared at Longbourn. The children, 2 girls of 6 and 8 years old, and 2 younger boys, would be left in the special care of their cousin Jane, who was the favourite, and whose steady good sense and sweetness of temper exactly suited her for looking after them in every way, teaching them, playing with them, and loving them. The Gardiners stayed at Longbourn for only one night, and set out the next morning with Elizabeth on their travels. One enjoyment was certain, that of pleasure in each other's company. Their journey took them to many interesting and well-known places: Oxford, Blenheim, Warwick, Kenilworth, and others. At last, after having seen all the chief sights of the area, they continued on their way to the little town of Lambton in Derbyshire, at the scene of Mrs. Gardiner's former home, and Elizabeth found that Pemberley was only 5 miles away from Lambton. In talking over their plans, Mrs. Gardiner expressed a wish to see the place again. Mr. Gardiner expressed his willingness, and their niece was asked for her approval. Elizabeth was in an awkward situation. She felt that she had no business at Pemberley, and she pretended, therefore, that she was tired of seeing great houses. Mrs. Gardiner thought this stupid, and Elizabeth did not know what to do. The possibility of meeting Mr. Darcy was frightening. She trembled at the very idea. Fortunately, she was able to find out from a servant at the hotel where they were staying that Pemberley's owner was absent. So when the subject was mentioned again the next morning, she readily agreed, because her unwillingness had turned to interest. As they drove along, Elizabeth's mind was too full for conversation, but she saw and admired every notable view. The park was very large, and they passed through a beautiful wood stretching over a wide area. Pemberley House was a large, fine-looking stone building on ground slightly higher than the park, and in front a stream had been widened without making it appear at all artificial. Elizabeth had never seen a place for which nature had done so much, or where natural beauty had been so little spoiled by awkward taste. Her aunt and uncle were equally warm in their admiration, and at that moment she felt that there were in fact advantages to being the Lady of Pemberley. On arriving at the house, they were admitted to the hall. The housekeeper was a respectable-looking woman who showed them around the chief rooms. From every window there were beauties to be seen. The rooms themselves were of good height and fine shape, and with furniture in excellent taste. I might have been the lady of this place, she thought. Instead of viewing it as a stranger, I might have been welcoming my aunt and uncle as my guests. But no, she remembered. I would not have been allowed to invite my relations. This was a lucky thought. It saved her from feeling sorry for herself. She wished very much to inquire of the housekeeper whether her master was really absent. At last, the question was asked by her uncle, and she turned away anxiously when the reply came. We expect him tomorrow with a large party of friends. Her aunt now called her to look at the picture and asked her with a smile how she liked it. It was of Wickham. The housekeeper mentioned his name and added, "He has now gone into the army, but I am afraid that he has turned out very wild." Mrs. Gardiner looked at her niece with a smile, but Elizabeth could not return it. They then looked at pictures of Mr. Darcy and his sister. "And is Miss Darcy as good-looking as his brother?" said Mr. Gardiner. "Oh, yes," replied the housekeeper. "The best-looking young lady that ever was seen. And so skilled. She plays and sings the whole day long. In the next room there is a new instrument that has just arrived for her, a present from my master. She is coming here tomorrow with him." "Does your master spend much time at Pemberley?" "Not as much as I would wish, sir. Miss Darcy is always here for the summer months." "Except," thought Elizabeth, "when she goes to Ramsgate." "If your master married, you might see more of him." "Yes, sir, but I do not know who is good enough for him." Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner smiled. "I say no more than the truth. I have never had an angry word from him in my life, and I have known him ever since he was 4 years old." Elizabeth's keenest attention was excited. This was praise of the strongest kind and most opposite to her ideas. "He is the best master that ever lived. Some people call him proud, but I never saw anything of it." Mr. Gardiner was highly amused as she continued to describe the good qualities of her master. He judged that her extreme praise of him was the result of family prejudice. "This fine account of him," whispered Mrs. Gardiner to her niece, "does not agree with his behavior to our poor friend." Elizabeth said rather quietly that they might have been deceived. "That is not very likely. Our information was too direct." They were then shown into a very pretty little sitting room with new furniture, and were told that it was done just to give pleasure to Miss Darcy, who had become fond of the room when last at Pemberley. "It is always the way with him," the housekeeper explained. "Whatever can give his sister pleasure is sure to be done." "Oh, he is a good brother," said Elizabeth. There was certainly at this moment in her mind a more gentle feeling towards him than she had ever had when she was closely acquainted with him. Every idea brought forward by the housekeeper was favourable to his character, and as she looked once again at this picture, she felt more grateful to him for his good opinion of her than she had ever done before. The house had now been examined, and they went outside in the charge of the Gardiner to admire the grounds. As they walked towards the river, Elizabeth turned back to look again, and as she did so, the owner of the building suddenly came forward from the road that led behind it. They were within 20 yards of each other, and his appearance was so sudden that it was impossible to avoid him. Their eyes met immediately. He stopped, and then for a moment seemed unable to move from surprise. Quickly recovering his self-control, though, he walked towards the party and spoke to Elizabeth, if not with perfect calm, at least with perfect politeness. She had immediately turned away, but when he approached, she received his greetings with a confusion that it was impossible to control. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner stood a little way off while he was talking to their niece, who, shocked by the meeting, hardly dared lift her eyes to his face and did not know what answer. She returned to his polite inquiries after her family. She was full of surprise at the change in his manner since they last parted, and found that every sentence that he spoke was increasing her confusion. As the realization of the awkwardness of her being found there returned to her mind, the few minutes in which they were together were some of the most uncomfortable in her life. He did not seem less shocked. When he spoke, his voice had none of his usual calmness, and he repeated some of his questions more than once. At last, every idea seemed to fail him, and after standing for a few minutes without saying a word, he suddenly went away. The others then joined her. Elizabeth was filled with shame and annoyance. Her coming there was the most unfortunate, most unwise thing in the world. How shameful it must appear to a man who thought so highly of himself. It might seem as if she had purposely put herself in his way again. Oh, why had she come? Or why did he come a day before he was expected? And his behavior so noticeably changed. What could it mean? It was astonishing that he should ever speak to her, but to speak with such politeness, to inquire after her family. Never in her life had she seen him so gentle. She did not know what to think. They now entered a beautiful walk by the water, but it was some time before Elizabeth could give it any attention, although she replied without thinking to the remarks of her companions. She greatly wished to know what was passing in Mr. Darcy's mind, and whether, in spite of everything, she was still dear to him. After wandering on for some time quite slowly, because Mrs. Gardiner was not a great walker and was becoming tired, they were again surprised by the sight of Mr. Darcy approaching them. Elizabeth saw that he had lost none of his recent politeness, and to show that she too could be polite, she began to admire the place, but she had not got beyond the word beautiful, when some unlucky thought reminded her that praise of Pemberley might be misunderstood. The color in her face deepened, and she said no more. As she paused, he asked her if she would do him the honor of introducing him to her friends. This was quite unexpected. What will be his surprise, she thought, when he knows who they are? He thinks that they are people of social position. The introduction, though, was made immediately, and as she named them as family relations of hers, she took a secret look at him to see how he bore it. It was plain that he was surprised, but instead of going away, he turned back with them and entered into conversation with Mr. Gardiner. Elizabeth could not help being pleased. It was comforting that he should know that she had some relations of whom there was no need to be ashamed. She listened carefully and felt happiness in every expression, every sentence of her uncle that showed his intelligence, his taste, or his good manners. The conversation soon turned to fishing, and she heard Mr. Darcy, with the greatest politeness, invite him to fish there as often as he chose. Mrs. Gardiner, who was walking arm in arm with Elizabeth, gave her a look of surprise. Elizabeth said nothing, but she was extremely pleased. The mark of attention must be all for herself. A little later, Mrs. Gardiner, tired by the exercise of the morning, found Elizabeth's arm not strong enough to support her, and therefore preferred her husband's. Mr. Darcy took her place by her knees. After a short silence, the lady spoke first. She wished him to know that she had been informed of his absence before she came to the place. He admitted that he had put forward his arrival because of some business. "The rest of my party," he continued, "will be here tomorrow, and among them are some with whom you are acquainted, Mr. Bingley and his sisters." Elizabeth answered only by a slight lowering of her head, and after a pause, he added, "There is also a person who especially wishes to be known to you. Will you allow me, or do I ask too much, to introduce my sister to you?" The surprise of such a request was great, too great for her to remember later in what manner she agreed. They now walked on in silence. Elizabeth was not comfortable. That was impossible, but she was pleased by his attention. When Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner came up to them at the house, they were all urged to go inside and take some tea, but this was politely refused. Mr. Darcy handed the ladies into the carriage, and when they drove off, Elizabeth saw him walking slowly towards the house. Her uncle and aunt now began to speak very favorably of his effect on them. They were cross with her, saying, "Why did you tell us he was so disagreeable?" Elizabeth excused herself as well as she could. She then felt it her duty to tell them, in as careful a manner as she could, that she believed herself to have been mistaken in thinking that he had been at fault with his treatment of Wickham. Mrs. Gardiner was surprised, but as they were now approaching the scenes of her youth, all her interest was soon taken up by the pleasures of her memories, and the meeting after many years of old friends, so Elizabeth was set free from awkward questions and could be left with her own thoughts.